get to the gun directors. They're firing way too low.
The word Midway was etched into Japanese memory in the same way Stalingrad was for the Germans. In January and February of 1942, the nation of the rising sun had reached an unprecedented expansion after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan had launched a massive offensive across the entire Pacific, conquering through its own blitzkrieg Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The Philippines were in the process of surrender, and the Allied fleet in Southeast Asia had been destroyed in the Java Sea. By mid-February, Japanese aviation had bombed Darwin, making Britain feel the pressure against Australia. Only in April did the raid by Doolittle's B-25 bombers over Tokyo prove that the archipelago was not impregnable. That small setback did not overshadow the victories, but it did confirm that American aircraft carriers were the enemy's most important offensive instrument. The Japanese Naval High Command knew the war could not be prolonged indefinitely. The industrial disparity was well known. Japan had launched its expansionist campaign to obtain resources that its enemy had in abundance. The United States had approved massive naval construction programs in 1940 and 1941. Its production capacity far exceeded Japan's in steel, fuel, and tonnage. The Japanese High Command understood that their only real chance consisted of destroying the principal American aircraft carriers before new ships entered service and before U.S. industry reached full output. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan was clear: attack the Midway archipelago to force the American carriers to come out and destroy them in battle. The island, located about 2,100 kilometers from Hawaii, expanded Japan's defensive perimeter, but its real value was to serve as bait. The concept answered the doctrine of the decisive battle: draw in the enemy and annihilate its core in a single campaign. Doolittle's raid in April confirmed that American carriers were the central threat. They had to be destroyed as soon as possible, and Midway would be the place. Japan had 6 carriers available for the battle, of which 4 were sent to Midway. The United States had 3 in the Pacific: the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the USS Yorktown. If those 3 were sunk, the carrier balance would be broken for months until new ships built belatedly in San Francisco and Norfolk arrived. When the Japanese fleet set itself in motion toward Midway in late May 1942, it did so by deploying a carefully assembled mechanism where each group fulfilled a precise function within a plan that demanded absolute coordination. At the center of the operation advanced Chūichi Nagumo's first air fleet with its 4 carriers. These were not just any ships. They were the same ones that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. First was Akagi, a former battlecruiser converted into an aircraft carrier that carried Admiral Nagumo's flag. Kaga, originally planned as a battleship, had been transformed into an enormous air platform. Then came Sōryū and Hiryū, more modern and faster, representing the most advanced technical core of Japanese carrier aviation. Between the 4, they carried close to 248 aircraft, highly maneuverable, long-range Zero fighters, Val dive bombers capable of placing bombs with devastating precision similar to the German Stuka, and lastly the Kate torpedo bombers, famous in the fleet for sinking British ships in the Indian Ocean. The immediate escort of those carriers was composed of fast battleships such as Haruna and Kirishima, designed to accompany mobile forces and provide heavy firepower in the event of a surface engagement. Around them operated the heavy cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, particularly important ships because long-range reconnaissance seaplanes were launched from their decks. Detecting any American movement in the open ocean in advance depended on those aircraft. A failure in that task could upset the entire balance of the operation. Farther back, hundreds of miles away, advanced the main body under Yamamoto's direct command aboard Yamato, the largest battleship in the world at that moment. It carried 4 6.0-millimeter guns capable of firing shells weighing more than a ton, and it was accompanied by other battleships such as Nagato and Mitsu, veterans of the previous war and symbols of Japanese naval power. This group was not intended to intervene in the initial air phase. Its function was to enter combat if the decisive surface battle occurred after the carrier clash. In parallel, the invasion force destined to occupy Midway advanced with troop transports. Their decks were packed with landing craft, ammunition, medical equipment, and even a field hospital. All that material and its soldiers were protected by cruisers such as Mogami and Mikuma, heavy ships armed with 203mm guns and prepared for long-range engagements. The amphibious force was supposed to consolidate the conquest of the island once its aviation had been neutralized. Meanwhile, to the north, in a simultaneous maneuver, another group headed toward the Aleutians. The light carriers Ryū and Junyo, smaller but still capable of projecting air power, would attack Dutch Harbor and cover the occupation of Attu and Kiska. This secondary operation aimed to disperse American attention and complicate their reaction. In total, Japan mobilized more than 200 ships in the theater of operations. Submarines were deployed in forward lines to intercept any sortie from Pearl Harbor. The central idea was based on groups in depth, with forces staggered along different axes and distances. Japan thus concentrated 4 of its 6 available fleet carriers and relied on the accumulated experience of its aviators, many of them survivors of Pearl Harbor, the Java Sea, and the Indian Ocean. However, that same magnitude meant the forces were separated by vast stretches of sea. Coordination depended on precise communications and effective reconnaissance. At 4:30 on June 4, Nagumo's navigation officer reported that they were at the launch point. Immediately, orders rang out over loudspeakers and movement began on deck to start operations. Under dim lighting, the flight crews of Akagi, Kaga, Sōryū, and Hiryū moved aircraft from the hangars to the flight decks, lifting them on elevators and starting engines as they prepared for deployment. At 4:45, under Nagumo's attentive gaze from the control tower, the first aircraft took off with the wind at its tail. Soon the first wave was in the air. 108 aircraft made up of 36 Aichi D-3, A-1 dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N2 torpedo planes, armed with 800 kilogram bombs for land targets, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M20 fighters as escort, making the skies tremble. The formation commander was Lieutenant Chūichi Tomonaga, a veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack. The objective was to neutralize Midway's runways, fuel depots, and anti-aircraft batteries, opening the way for the invasion force advancing farther back. While that wave moved away to the southeast, Nagumo kept the second wave in reserve, composed of approximately 93 aircraft that were initially armed with torpedoes for a possible attack against enemy ships. This reserve was the decisive element of the plan. If the American carriers appeared, they were to be attacked immediately with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Reconnaissance began at the same time. Seaplanes roared off the catapults of the heavy cruisers Tone and Chikuma, pushing forward to explore broad sectors to the east and northeast. However, one of Tone's aircraft assigned to the most critical sector suffered a delay of about 30 minutes due to technical difficulties during launch, disrupting the planned timetable. At 6:20, the first Japanese wave reached Midway. American defenses responded intensely. F-2A Buffalo and F-4F Wildcat fighters attempted to intercept the attackers, while anti-aircraft batteries opened fire from the ground. The Vals dove as if parading through the artillery, managing to set fuel stores on fire and damage installations, but they did not fully neutralize the island's operational capacity. Tomonaga was furious and ordered his messenger to send a message around 7:15, indicating that a second attack was necessary to destroy the remaining targets. On Akagi, Nagumo and his staff evaluated the report while assistants moved flags across the operations map. Up to that moment, there was no conclusive news about the presence of American carriers. Consequently, around 7:15, the order was given to rearm the second wave with land-use bombs capable of destroying the runway and smashing the concrete roofs for a renewed attack against Midway. Immediately, a machine of hundreds of men began removing torpedoes from the aircraft in the hangars and replacing them with high-explosive bombs. The process was complex and required careful handling of ordnance. Gloved hands moved, signaling to raise and lower chains, secure fuses, and remove carrying racks inside those enclosed steel spaces where adrenaline filled the air. At 7:28, an agitated messenger arrived at Nagumo's operations center. "Nervous," he reported. It was the message from Tone's delayed seaplane. 10 enemy ships, high speed to the east. The report did not specify the presence of carriers. Nagumo took a deep breath and consulted his men. Forced to wait for confirmation, he ordered the pilot to return and obtain a new report. At 7:45, the same seaplane communicated that among the ships sighted there was at least one of them. In that instant, the strategic situation changed completely. With an energy-charged shout, Nagumo ordered the change to be stopped. It was time to use torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The hangar crews had to reverse the process begun minutes earlier. The decks were being prepared to receive the first wave returning from Midway. Many aircraft had already consumed much of their fuel and needed immediate refueling. The combination of planes landing, others being rearmed, and ordnance being moved inside the hangars created a situation of intense activity. It was the error that would change the course of the battle. Mitsuo Fuchida, an experienced pilot who was supposed to lead the second wave, was wounded and therefore did not participate in the flight. After the battle, he wrote that command considered the situation manageable and that contact with the enemy did not alter the conviction that the main blow could be executed successfully. However, the delay in reconnaissance and the need to reorganize the second wave meant that the Japanese force lost the temporal initiative. At 8:30, swarms of aircraft returning from Midway were circling, waiting their turn. The entire procedure required clearing the deck to allow landings, moving aircraft to lower hangars, refueling them, and preparing them again. It was time Nagumo could not afford to lose while each carrier maneuvered to align into the wind. At that moment, the First Air Fleet was in a critical transition phase. It had delivered its initial strike, received an incomplete report of enemy contact, begun a weapons change, and reversed it. The decisive battle that had been planned for weeks was beginning to unfold under less controlled conditions than expected. The approach had been silent and orderly. The next phase would depend on how quickly Japan could reorganize its air power against an enemy whose presence was now a confirmed fact. Shortly after 9 on June 4, alarms thundered and anti-aircraft batteries received the order to man their combat stations. The radar aboard Akagi had detected a large blot on its cathode ray screen. It was indeed the first American formation launching its attack. It was Torpedo Squadron VT-8 from the carrier Hornet. In total, 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers under Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron arrived without fighter escort, flying at low altitude. The Devastators in tight formation looked slow, with a maximum speed of barely 330 kilometers per hour, carrying Mark 13 torpedoes whose reliability was limited. Officers on the bridge could hardly believe what they were seeing. The attack seemed tactically clumsy, like ducks in a straight line and at very low altitude. The Mitsubishi Zero fighters, maintaining combat air patrol, descended like swarms of bees to intercept them. Faster and more maneuverable, they attacked with a clear advantage, unleashing long bursts that started fires and sent planes crashing into the water in white clouds of foam. In minutes, all 15 VT-8 Devastators were shot down. Only one crewman, Ensign George Gay, survived the ditching. From the Japanese decks, the fight confirmed immediate air superiority. Anti-aircraft fire from battleships and destroyers complemented the defense. The operational perception within Japanese command was that the threat had been contained effectively. But amid the celebrations, Torpedo Squadron VT-6 from Enterprise appeared, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, with 14 more Devastators. They arrived as well at low altitude, without coordination with dive bombers and with insufficient protection. They were intercepted in the same way, with the Zeros shooting each one down while their pilots savored victory. Japanese defense was again effective. Most of the torpedo bombers were destroyed before they could drop accurately. Some torpedoes entered the water, but none hit an apparent disaster. Almost simultaneously from Yorktown, another squadron advanced with 12 Devastators in an act of desperate boldness. These also attacked at low altitude and were met by Zero fighters and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Of the 41 torpedo bombers launched in total by the 3 American carriers, only 6 returned. None achieved a hit. Reports on Akagi's bridge indicated that the combat air patrol was doing its job. However, the cost of that defense was less visible at the time. However, the fighters were exhausting their capacity too quickly. The Japanese combat air patrol consisted of a limited number of Zeros in constant rotation. When they descended to intercept, they burned fuel and ammunition. The carriers' evasive maneuvers to avoid torpedoes disrupted the original formation, and the ships had to turn sharply, increasing speed to 30 knots, making recovery and launch operations more difficult and worsening the overall cycle. In the hangars, meanwhile, the rearming process continued. Aircraft that had returned from Midway needed to be refueled and fitted with new ordnance. Other planes that had been reconfigured from land bombs back to torpedoes were being prepared to take off. The Japanese rearming system involved handling torpedoes weighing more than 800 kilograms and large bombs inside enclosed spaces. The personnel worked quickly, but every change required time. Nagumo and his staff faced an ambiguous situation. They had successfully repelled the first attacks. However, they still had not launched their strike against the enemy carriers. Japanese doctrine favored the first coordinated attack as the decisive element. At this point, Japan had reacted defensively. Although the enemy seemed to have suffered severe losses, the initiative had not yet turned into a Japanese counterstrike. The air combat also generated a false sense of security. The near-total destruction of the American torpedo bombers may have reinforced the idea that the main threat had already been neutralized. Fuchida later maintained that Japanese command underestimated the possibility of a simultaneous attack from higher altitude. At that moment, officers on Akagi's bridge who watched the smoke columns from enemy aircraft could interpret the fight as a partial victory. What was not clearly perceived was the cumulative effect of those torpedo attacks. By forcing the Zeros to descend and compelling evasive maneuvers, the Americans disrupted the enemy defensive structure. The combat air patrol became concentrated at low altitude. The upper sectors of the sky were temporarily less watched. If the ships could not be turned into the wind for flight operations, everything would be interrupted in any attempt to immediately launch the second Japanese wave. Toward 10, the situation seemed to stabilize for the defenders. The enemy torpedo bombers had been practically annihilated. The Japanese ships had suffered no damage. However, Nagumo's air power still had not taken off to attack the confirmed American carriers in the area. The time window was narrowing. In hangars and on decks, the rearming process was in its final phase, but it still was not complete. At approximately 10:20, alarms roared again. From the decks of Kaga, Akagi, and Sōryū, observers detected two late dark points descending out of the sun. The alert was not immediate. Some later Japanese reports described the surprise as almost total. Mitsuo Fuchida wrote that the dive bombers appeared as if they had sprung from the clear sky, and that air defense did not have enough time to intercept them at altitude. They were, indeed, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers of squadrons VB-6 and VS-6 from Enterprise and Yorktown. They emerged from an altitude near 4,500–5,000 meters. They had arrived after a prolonged search and a decisive diversion that led them to follow the wake of the Japanese destroyer Arashi, which was racing back toward the main formation after attacking the American submarine Nautilus. That tactical detail, a white foaming trail in the middle of the ocean, guided the American bombers directly to the Japanese carriers. At 10:22, the coordinated attack began. The SBDs dove nearly vertically, at angles between 60 and 70 degrees, releasing 4 kilograms armor-piercing bombs designed to penetrate decks before detonating. Kaga, one of Japan's largest carriers, was hit by at least 4 direct strikes within seconds. The bombs pierced the flight deck and exploded in hangars where aircraft were being refueled and armed. The result was an immediate chain of secondary explosions fueled by aviation, gasoline, and exposed munitions. Almost simultaneously, Sōryū took 3 critical hits. One bomb penetrated near the ship's center, detonating in the lower hangar. Another exploded near fuel storage. Fires spread rapidly. The Japanese ventilation system and the relatively light hangar structure facilitated the spread of fire, consuming everything in its path and killing thousands of men. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, was struck by only one direct bomb, but the hit was decisive. The bomb penetrated near the central elevator and detonated in the upper hangar, where several torpedo planes were being prepared. Fire spread quickly toward fuel depots and supply lines. Captain Taijiro Aoki attempted to coordinate damage control efforts, but internal explosions made any effective containment difficult. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were engulfed in uncontrollable fires. From Akagi's bridge, Nagumo watched columns of smoke rising from Kaga and Sōryū. Everything had changed irreversibly in the blink of an eye. Fuchida later described the moment as a devastating blow that paralyzed Japanese offensive capability before the planned counterattack could be executed. Attempts to organize an immediate launch from Akagi became impossible. The decks were damaged, elevators were disabled, and hangars had turned into spaces flooded with flames. On Kaga, secondary explosions continued for hours. The crew tried to flood storage and isolate sections, but the buildup of flammable vapors made any internal movement extremely dangerous. On Akagi, toward noon, Captain Aoki reported that damage control was impossible. The flames spread without effective containment. The order to abandon ship was considered inevitable hours later. Kaga and Sōryū were in similar condition. Crews were progressively evacuated to nearby destroyers. The decisive phase of the battle had lasted less than 10 minutes. In that brief interval, Japan's carrier superiority in the Central Pacific was irreversibly compromised. The strategic initiative Japan had tried to force at Midway flipped with a speed that surprised even Japanese officers themselves. The meticulously planned deployment had been disarticulated by a combination of delayed reconnaissance, low-altitude defensive concentration, and internal vulnerability during rearming. The smoke from the 3 burning carriers marked the end of the Japanese offensive as it had been conceived. The battle, however, was not over, because Hiryū was still operational. Hiryū, under Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi and Captain Tomeo Kaku, was sailing slightly separated to the north of the main formation when American dive bombers fell upon Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū. That separation resulting from prior maneuvers left it outside the immediate axis of the attack. From its bridge, 3 enormous columns of smoke could be seen rising on the horizon. The magnitude of the disaster was obvious. In minutes, the First Air Fleet had been reduced to a single operational deck. Yamaguchi acted quickly. At approximately 10:54, he ordered an immediate counteroffensive. Hiryū's air group consisted of 0 fighters, D3, A1 dive bombers, and B5 N2 torpedo planes. Many of those aircraft had not yet been committed to combat that morning. The objective now was to locate and strike the American carrier responsible for the blow. At 11, the first wave launched from Hiryū. 18 Aichi D3A1 dive bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters, took off under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. The course was set toward the last enemy contact report. The sea was covered by scattered formations of low and mid-level clouds, which made visual identification difficult but also offered some concealment. At 12:20, the Japanese bombers sighted the carrier Yorktown. From the Japanese perspective, it was believed the Americans had only 2 carriers in the area. Yorktown, damaged weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea, had been repaired in only 72 hours at Pearl Harbor and was back in action, something Japanese command did not know. The D3A1S began their near-vertical dive from heights above 3,000 meters. Yorktown maneuvered at maximum speed, drawing wide arcs in the water. Without warning, it was hit by at least 3 bombs that penetrated the flight deck and detonated on lower levels. The blasts ripped up planking, opened bulkheads, and exploded with such violence that the ship momentarily lost propulsion and began to list. From Hiryū, news of the hits was received as a sign the battle could still be turned around. Yamaguchi ordered a second wave prepared, this time composed mainly of B5N2 torpedo bombers armed with Type 91 torpedoes. At approximately 13:30, 10 torpedo planes, escorted by 6 Zero fighters, took off. Japanese command expected that Yorktown, already damaged, would be a vulnerable target. Around 14:30, the second Japanese wave appeared over Yorktown. The Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers descended, almost skimming the sea, splitting up to force the ship to divide its maneuver. Yorktown turned violently while its anti-aircraft guns fired continuously. Some Japanese aircraft were hit, but several maintained their course to launch range. The Type 91 torpedoes entered the water with precision. 2 struck the port side almost immediately. The explosions threw up enormous columns of water and shook the ship's internal structure. Compartments began flooding rapidly, and the list became visible within minutes. Propulsion failed again, and the tilt increased progressively. Unable to stabilize the ship, the order was given to abandon it. From the air, the Japanese watched the large carrier stopped and listing wrapped in smoke. For Hiryū's command, the enemy seemed finally out of action. On the remaining American carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, their air groups were reorganized for the final blow against the Japanese. By mid-afternoon, reconnaissance aircraft located the last Japanese carrier, and at 16:30, SBD Dauntless dive bombers began their approach to attack. At 17:03, while Hiryū was still trying to reorganize its deck after the return of its aircraft, American SBD Dauntless bombers appeared from high altitude. They dove almost vertically, with the sun behind them. This time, the surprise was minimal, but the reaction margin was small. The Japanese combat air patrol was not in optimal position, and anti-aircraft defense began firing late and with limited angles. Within minutes, at least 4,454 kilogram bombs pierced the carrier's deck. One struck near the forward elevator and penetrated to the lower hangar before detonating. Another exploded in the central hangar, where several torpedo and bomber aircraft were being refueled and rearmed. The blasts lifted steel plates, hurled incandescent fragments, and triggered immediate fires fueled by aviation, gasoline, and exposed ammunition. Flames advanced rapidly through ventilation ducts and open hangar spaces, repeating the destructive pattern that had consumed Akagi, Kaga, and Sōryū hours earlier. Captain Kaku attempted to organize damage control, but secondary explosions made the severity obvious. By about 18, Hiryū was engulfed in uncontrollable flames. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi refused to abandon the ship. According to later testimony, he insisted on remaining aboard with his standard-bearer until the end. The order to abandon ship was carried out by much of the crew, which was transferred to escorting destroyers. During the early hours of June 5, Hiryū was finally sunk by Japanese torpedoes to prevent its capture. At Yamamoto's headquarters aboard Yamato, the situation was received with increasing gravity. The original plan contemplated a decisive engagement after the initial destruction of the American carriers. Instead, the First Air Fleet had been virtually annihilated in less than a day. The possibility of continuing the offensive operation was fading. Japanese doctrine had depended on the first coordinated blow. Now the fleet lacked the principal instrument to execute it. The decisive stage of the battle ended as night fell on June 4. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers along with a large portion of its most experienced aviators. Hiryū's counteroffensive had demonstrated tactical capability, but it was not enough to reverse the imbalance created in the critical minutes of the morning. The Japanese offensive at Midway, conceived as the culmination of imperial expansion, had been disarticulated in less than 12 hours. In the early hours of June 5, aboard the battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received consolidated situation reports. The loss of the First Air Fleet was a fact. Without sufficient air cover, forcing a surface battle against American carriers was extremely risky. Even so, for several hours Yamamoto considered continuing the operation. Japanese doctrine still contemplated the possibility of a night engagement with battleships and heavy cruisers, trusting in the night-fighting superiority the Imperial Navy had cultivated for years. Even so, everything indicated Japan was facing the odds. The Japanese fleet was widely dispersed. Yamato, Nagato, and Mitsu were hundreds of miles behind Nagumo's group. The heavy cruisers of the invasion force sailed farther south, and there was no necessary coordination to regroup and launch a night attack. In addition, American submarines were already operating in the area. The risk of advancing without air cover was obvious. Finally, on the morning of June 5, tired and depressed, Yamamoto ordered the general withdrawal of the fleet in a voice that filled his men with concern. The occupation operation of Midway was cancelled. Priority shifted to preserving the rest of the fleet. Strategically, the battle was over. During the retreat, an additional incident occurred that worsened the losses like an ill omen. The heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, part of the bombardment force, collided while maneuvering to avoid a supposed submarine at night. The impact severely damaged Mogami's bow and compromised Mikuma's structure, forcing both ships to reduce speed and leaving them exposed to air attacks. On June 6 and 7, American aircraft located the damaged cruisers. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet attacked repeatedly. Mikuma was hit by multiple bombs that detonated torpedoes stored on deck, causing massive explosions. The ship sank on June 7th. Mogami, though severely damaged, managed to withdraw. Meanwhile, the American carrier Yorktown, which had been torpedoed by Hiryū's aircraft, remained afloat on June 5 under intensive damage control efforts. However, the Japanese submarine I-168 penetrated the destroyer screen and fired torpedoes on June 6. Two hit the destroyer Hamon, which sank quickly, and at least one struck Yorktown again. The carrier finally sank on June 7. From the Japanese point of view, this action offered limited consolation. One enemy carrier confirmed as a loss. The final figures reflected the magnitude of the Japanese setback. 4 fleet carriers sunk, more than 250 aircraft destroyed, and approximately 3,000 men killed. Among them, many veteran pilots whose experience could not be replaced quickly. The United States lost Yorktown, the destroyer Hamon, and about 150 aircraft. The asymmetry in losses of trained airmen was particularly significant. In the Japanese post-war analysis, Mitsuo Fuchida and Masatake Okumiya pointed out that the defeat was not the product of chance but of structural failures in reconnaissance, dispersion of forces, and doctrinal rigidity. Confidence in the first decisive blow had been invalidated. The time window the High Command believed still open closed at Midway. Yamamoto acknowledged the strategic gravity of the defeat, although publicly the result was presented in a softened manner in Japan. The Imperial Navy tried to maintain internal morale. The reality was a disastrous defeat. The loss of the core of its carrier aviation irreversibly altered the balance of power in the Central Pacific. Strategic initiative passed to the United States, which only weeks later would begin the Guadalcanal campaign and the end of the Rising Sun's expansionism. The Japanese withdrawal after Midway was not a disorderly flight, but a controlled retreat by a fleet still powerful on the surface. The battleships remained intact, cruisers and destroyers retained combat capability. But the war in the Pacific would no longer be decided by battleships, but by aircraft carriers and by the industrial capacity to replace them. In that domain, the loss of 4 experienced decks and their aviators meant something no communique could hide. Japan had reached its limit forever.